research is supported by the government more than any other source. The average civilian may think we're supported by industry. And as you know, that's true, but only very partially. Most of our research is supported by the public. If the public don't trust us, if they don't trust us to do reasonable, fair, high integrity research, we'll lose their trust, and they won't agree to fund it. So the result is, let me double check this 1 second. That there is really this code for professional ethics for researchers. We call it responsible conduct of research. And it leaves open this question, and responsible conduct of research is the phrase used industry-wide. We talk about education, the responsible conduct of research. We're required by HHS funding and NSF funding to provide our trainees courses and guidance on responsible conduct research. And it leaves us asking, if that's the basis of our code, what really is responsible conduct of research? And I really like this quotation. This is from Nick Stenick, recently retired faculty member at the University of Michigan. And he wrote, the responsible conduct of research, in general terms, is really just good citizenship applied to professional life. In general, responsible conduct of research is simply good citizenship applied to professional life. Now here I might call upon you to unmute your microphone and speak up, but you don't know that you know this, but you know what the general rules are of good citizenship. You learned the basic good citizenship rules probably in preschool when you started kindergarten. In fact, you received a good citizenship grade. So speak up. I ask you, what do they teach you? What are the good citizenship rules? And then, by the way, just as a reminder, and I don't want to offend anybody, but these are written like Old Testament commands. They're don'ts. They tell us what we're not supposed. Don't do this. Don't do that. They're written as don'ts. It has a profound impact on me. But what are these provisions? What are these good citizenship rules that we learned way back when?
Be honest and trustworthy.
Oh yeah, but okay, those are good. I was taught a different background phrase. If I give you the first one, will you get the rest? Anybody want to take a guess?
I'll try.
Okay. So if I said don't lie.
Cheat or steal.
Yeah, who said cheat and steal? Was that Phyllis? Lie, cheat, and steal. Okay, in fact, I think most would say, oh yeah, I kind of remember that. In fact, if you took don't lie, cheat, or steal, and you mixed in a little bit of the golden rule and treat others the way you expect to be treated, that would get you by pretty much everywhere you'd go, okay? Don't lie, cheat, or steal, and treat everybody the way you expect to be treated. That's a pretty good start, okay? So as far as building a society, those are pretty good. Those are good starting points. I want you to remember those in case you've forgotten, because I'm going to come back to them. But I think don't lie, cheat, or steal are important foundational concepts upon which an awful lot of what we do is based. And I think that's what Stenick is talking about, that if we use those good citizenship rules, don't lie, cheat, or steal, and we applied them to our professional life as a researcher, we could figure out what we needed to do. So what do we need to apply it to? What are the topics in the researcher's life that he or she has to think that these lie, cheat, or steal work in? And one of these, and I put this first on purpose, but one of the most important ethical research topics is working with human subjects. And that's because, well, we're human subjects. We're worthy of the highest level of ethical and moral concern. We know, we have an institutional review board here. This is institutionalized. Our respect for human subjects has built up around it a fairly large infrastructure and edifice. We have an IRB, an institutional review board. We have more than one. And all human subject research at the University of Virginia is reviewed and approved by an appropriately appointed IRB. I have the great pleasure and honor of working with our IRBs, and they are careful, thinking, hardworking individuals, including community members, by the way. It's a requirement that we add non-scientists and community members. This isn't just a bunch of old gray-haired guys sitting around going, well, it sounds okay to me. We have community representatives. We've got to answer to the community. So they're sitting there at the table and they're voting members. And they're part of our human subject protection operation. So we need to think about how these professional standards apply to human subject protection. We also have a very major responsibility to working with our way that we work with animals. And there are a lot of very special issues when we work with animals. As you know, we have a very active, again, statutorily required Animal Care and Use Committee, which reviews and approves all use of animals in our animal care system. The provisions there are incredibly complicated, and you just can't even imagine how much guidance there is and how crazy the requirements are. The requirements for air temperature and airflow require that we have very specialized air handlers for all of our animals, and they have to be on backup power. At UVA, if we lose power, the most important thing is we supply backup power to our patients. But second on the list are our animals. So we're going to care for our animals in case of power failure more than we care for our workers. I don't mean to demean our workers in that, but we're going to make certain their temperature, their humidity, their environmental concerns, their food and water are addressed, even if we have a power failure. I think that's important that we do that. It's important that we recognize that. We're their stewards. We have to look after them. But in many ways, there's some craziness here, and people are in many cases more concerned about how we care for our animals than how we care for humans. And there are stricter requirements for our animal research in some cases than there are for our human research. It's reversed in Europe where the concerns flip. But here the public has much greater concern with our use of animals than with humans. I apologize that my phone is ringing. I forgot to turn off the ringer. I don't know if I can make it stop. When you take a break, I'll turn off the ringer. Research misconduct and fraud. I'm going to talk about this extensively. So let me just list it here. But research misconduct is tremendously important. And I'm not going to talk about it now because I'm going to come back to it. Authorship and peer review is an important topic. This is, in fact, I'm working on a couple of cases right now where authorship issues are boiling over into research misconduct matters. But questions about who should be listed as an author in a publication are hugely problematic. Proper credit, proper attribution is very, very important. And our faculty participate in peer review. So they're not only authors, but they're reviewers of their peers' work. And they're participating in that peer review role is also very important. And that has to be done carefully, thoughtfully, and ethically. Conflict of interest and conflict of commitment, I'm going to talk about more in a second. But it's very important that we consider conflict of interest issues as well as conflict of commitment issues. I'm going to come back to them. There are also some other really important RCR, responsible conduct research topics. I put these on the second slide in slightly smaller font. They're not less important, but who owns the data and who owns the intellectual property is a terribly important question. And there are huge issues surrounding disputes here. And without getting weird or complicated, we recognize, you recognize, I recognize that the university owns the data for our research. We let our faculty think they own it. But if they leave and they want to take it with them, there's a provision for them to ask for permission to do so, because the sponsors insist, as you probably will know, that we're the data stewards. We have to look after the data. We also have to be very concerned about mentor and advisee relationships. This is a very crucial area, and our faculty are often not guided or trained here as well as we'd like. Research collaborations are a critical area. One of the complicated cases I've got on my desk right now involves a dispute around a research collaboration. Increasingly, our investigators are collaborating with researchers in other departments, in other schools and other institutions. And so the issues that surround research collaborations have to be considered carefully. We also have institutional biosafety and radiation safety issues. Those have to be handled properly, carefully, as part of our responsible conduct research. Increasingly, I'm going to have to move them up. Export control issues and foreign
Hello,
influence
this is Julia.
issues. Yes. A question?
Pardon?
A question, Julia?
Okay, great. I'll be by this afternoon. Thank you.
Oh,
Bye.
we'll encourage Julia to mute, but she'll catch the second. This whole idea of foreign influence, in fact, I would say export controls weren't things we were thinking about 10 years ago, but we've been thinking about them a lot since then. The foreign influence issues have become huge in the last 2 years. This has taken a lot of our attention, and it's made a lot of the news. I didn't put any slides together on this, but as you know, we've made the news over a foreign influence matter, and we've got to be very careful about how we counsel and instruct our faculty to address foreign influence issues. But now I want to talk to I want to turn to one of the two big topics, that's conflict of interest. And when we say conflict of interest in this context, we really mean financial conflict of interest. There are lots of conflicts of interest that don't have anything to do with finances. My favorite example, though it's not relevant as much now as it used to be, is I have a favorite parking spot. It's one of the end of the row facing this way. When I get to the lot early in the morning, I can get that parking place. And so I work hard to get there early so I can get that parking place because it's my favorite parking place. And if somebody else gets there earlier, they're going to take it instead of me. So we have a conflict of interest over possession of that parking space, okay? That conflict of interest, I hope, doesn't boil over into blows or into our coming to words, but it is a conflict of interest. In a department, if we have several junior faculty, but only a couple of tenure track slots, the faculty may be competing for those tenure track slots. If I submit a grant application, grant funds are limited. We can't, all grant applicants are not going to get funded. So we're conflicting, we're competing for my interest in getting funded conflicts with your interest in getting funded. But for the most part, those conflicts are natural in what we do. But financial conflicts may not be. So when we say conflict of interest, we may not add financial to the word and say financial conflicts of interest. But when we say COI, we really mean financial conflicts of interest. What is a financial conflict of interest? The worry is that outside financial interests might interfere with our professional duties. You might be able to come up with a simpler definition, but I think this comes close for me. When we say financial conflict of interest, what we're worried about is my outside financial interests interfering with my professional duties. The worry isn't that I have these outside financial interests. In fact, I don't know that you should be concerned that I own a pizza place on North 29, or that my wife has a flower shop, or that I run a wedding photography business on the side. In fact, there's a side of me that says, in some ways, I think that's none of your business. But if those outside professional interests start interfering with my professional duties, then I might have a conflict of interest that requires some discussion. So what are these outside financial interests? This is code, but it's actually taken from the federal regulations. But we refer to what we call significant financial interest. We use the definition, we use the abbreviation SFI, significant financial interest. We're not worried about trivial financial interest. We're interested in significant financial interest. And usually, these are either income, you're making money, you're earning money on the side, or you own something, you have equity in something. So those two categories, income or equity, pretty much wrap up what it is that constitutes a significant financial interest. It's either income or equity. And again, the concern is that these might bias or compromise my professional duties. In fact, the way I've written this slide, if you're following along, is the concern is that this might cause bias or compromise my judgment, my objectivity, or my decision making when it comes to the way I design, conduct, or report on research. This is really part of an interesting side note, and that is we have huge federal regulations. I have my copy right beside my desk here. And the federal regulations don't use the phrase conflict of interest. That's not the title of the statutes. The title is objectivity in research. So the government isn't worried about the fact that I might be making money on the side. They don't really care that I might be making money on the side. They are worried that the money I make might interfere with my judgment, that I might lose objectivity. The government is concerned that they get good value for their dollar and that my work is not biased, that I haven't lost objectivity because these outside financial interests. It's kind of a funny point, but I think that it's the government saying our focus is on what matters to us, and that is the work was done properly, objectively, fairly, consistently, reasonably. So the federal statutes, I think it's 50 CFR 93 Part A. I don't quote it often, but it's titled Objectivity in Research. And as a sponsor of our research, of course, they have every reason to be concerned about it. In addition to sponsors' concerns, there are some other concerns which we might come back to later. So that's not the only set of issues. There are other issues as well, and I'll return to some. There were, okay, so it's 42 CFR Part 50, Subpart F. I've been around long enough that I remember when we changed these rules. These still feel like the new rules to me, but they were proposed in 2011 and they took effect in 2012. But we've been dealing with these new regulations now for just a little over 8 years. And it was a very substantial change in the HHS regulations. And they changed from what I call a transaction-driven disclosure of conflicts. So in the past, at grant award time, investigators were asked to indicate whether they had a conflict of interest. The HHS regulations have changed instead to a disclosure of financial interests that's not transaction driven, or it's not based upon grant award, comes at a different time in the cycle, as you know. And we don't look to the investigator to decide they've got a conflict. We look at the financial interest and make a determination that it is or is not related to the research. And if it is related, we actually do a relatedness review. Many of you probably have been involved in referring awards for relatedness reviews. Typically, those either go to Dave Driscoll or to Rob Marriage or to me. But we don't ask the PI, we don't ask the investigator to say, is this a conflict? We leave that to the institution to make that determination. And it's not just because we don't think they'll do a good job, but we have better insight on what might constitute a conflict. So we have this new, instead of transaction driven, if you will, an annual disclosure of financial interest, not related to projects. We do a separate determination of relatedness and conflict of interest. This 2012 statute also required investigator training, and I don't know if I indicate on the next slide, but there's also a requirement in some cases for disclosure of this information if we find a conflict. If I hadn't added that slides, I'll go back and add it before I teach this next time. But critical to this is the requirement that investigators have disclosed their financial interests prior to the time of grant submission. Let me say that again. The requirement in the regulations is that investigators must have disclosed their financial interests prior to the time of submission. We don't have to do anything with that information, but they must have disclosed to us. And key to this is an appreciation that it's not just the PI, It's any investigator on the project. Here, HHS didn't do us a favor. We all grew up learning what key personnel meant, and key personnel was the phrase that we learned to think about, work with, live with. But they drifted away from key personnel and they invented this new term, investigator. And it's defined as any individual who's responsible for the design, conduct, or reporting. So it could be that, well, the PI, likely, it's hard to imagine the PI not being one of these people, but that means other people on the project might qualify as investigators, and they'll have to have completed this disclosure. We don't get into arguments about this. I think we overinterpret this, but that's not a bad thing. You'll notice that the phrase of the definition is responsible for the design. It doesn't say responsible design, conduct, or reporting. It doesn't say involved in the design, conduct, or reporting. So for example, if you've got a study coordinator on a clinical trial, she or he might be responsible for, or might be heavily involved in patient recruiting, or in history and physicals, or maybe even handing out the drugs. But likely they're not responsible for the design, conduct, or reporting. If they are, they qualify and they should disclose. But it's a pretty high bar. I think I don't know if any of you are at C's, but C's has taken the approach, the School of Engineering, that all graduate students on our submitted projects qualify. They have all their graduate students disclose. That's probably not a bad thing, and it gets them taking our training. It gets them used to the idea that disclosing financial interest is part of what we do. It becomes part of the way of life. But strictly speaking, a graduate student project likely is not responsible for the design, conduct, or reporting. Involved in, sure, but maybe not responsible. But everyone who's responsible must have submitted a disclosure. And so what does the investigator have to do? When they're submitting a proposal, they must have a current financial disclosure in our electronic system. Upon receipt of an award, so they might have had a current, that is within the last year, disclosure when they submitted. If that's aged out and it's no longer current, they've got to update it when the award comes through. So when we get the award, we have to make certain we have a current, that is the last 12 years disclosure. And they have to have completed the conflict of interest training. That's done online before the funds are expended. That's pretty tough. But I think you have ways. I don't look at this, but I think you can see in the UBI or the Research UVA system we've got that the training has been completed for all of the investigators on a proposal. Investigators are also required to update their disclosures annually, and we send out reminders, or when significant financial interests change. And they've got to retake the conflict of interest class every 4 years. We send them a reminder. But so their responsibility is to have a disclosure on file, which they keyed up to date, and they have to take the appropriate training. What do we have to do? If an award is made, we have to determine whether any of the investigators on the project have disclosed financial interests. Not just completed the process of disclosure, because many of them complete the disclosure but have no financial interest to disclose. In fact, that's what I see in the records that I look at. Disclosure, it'll say none. They had nothing to disclose. But that means they completed the process. At award time, we have to make certain that all the investigators have completed the process, but we're concerned about whether they had any financial interest to disclose. If they do have disclosed financial interests, we have to see whether those financial interests are related to the project. So it's kind of a funny point, but you could easily have a significant financial interest which you had to disclose. I might, if I'm in pharmacology, for example, I might have a small outside company involved in pharmacology research. And as such, I'm going to have to report that equity on my annual report, but that may have nothing to do with my grant. So I've disclosed it, but we have to review it when the award comes through to see if it's related. After we make a determination it's not related, the award can process normally. If it is related to the project, then we have to ask if there's a conflict. And again, it's a subtle point, but it could be related to the project, but there isn't any conflict. That's a little bit harder to decide. And we refer these related significant financial interest to the Conflict of Interest Committee. They're pretty good at this, and they've got a pretty good broad representation of both administrative and research faculty, administrators and research faculty, and they are pretty good at knowing what a conflict of interest might be and what to do if there is one. So what does a financial interest look like? The federal definition says a financial interest exists, a financial conflict of interest on a project exists if the financials could directly and significantly affect the design, conduct, or reporting. Again, that's that loss of objectivity they're worried about. If the SFI could directly impact the design, conduct, or reporting, there's a financial conflict of interest. Now, interestingly, that doesn't mean we can't do the project or we have to tell the investigator they can't participate. We can, in fact, permit conflicted investigators to participate, usually by doing one of three things. And the three things are I'm reminded of the initials MRE, meal ready to eat, for any of you with a military background. M, manage, R, reduce, E, eliminate. So if there's a financial conflict of interest, either we manage it, we reduce it so it's below threshold, or we eliminate it. And that's not necessarily in that order. So if an investigator had equity in an outside company and that constituted a conflict, he or she could say, well, heck, I'll just sell the equity. I'll just sell my interest in this company. They could eliminate the financial interest and therefore eliminate the conflict. Or more likely, we manage the conflict. So this, because that's almost always the choice, not reducing or eliminating the financial interest to reduce or eliminate the conflict, we almost always propose a conflict management plan. And that's a required part of the solution for an HHS grant. And we have to tell them what that's going to be. We have to report the details of the management plan. In fact, if we have on an HHS award a financial conflict of interest, we have to notify the sponsor that we have a COI.
Dave?
Yeah, that's Neil. Yes, Neil.
Yeah, could I just throw in a footnote about faculty startups and managing potential interest there? Because that comes up a lot.
You want me to talk about them, or you have a specific question?
No, I mean, I think that you're probably you may work towards that, but I just wanted to throw that in as something that we need to be aware of, and that's often where you end up managing these potential conflicts.
Yeah, I just want to mention it now, Neil. I appreciate you bringing that up. This is and I apologize, I'm lecturing because I am lecturing, but we often talk about what we're doing as translational. The magic phrase is often from bench to bedside, but we want to, when we can, translate the things we learn in a research environment for societal benefit. We want to benefit the society. This is the good for society that we hear President Ryan talk about. And that usually means transferring this technology outside the university in a way that enables it to be commercialized. And in some cases, that may mean that the faculty member, him or herself, or they with their family members or friends, may form a company around it. And it is provided this isn't a serious conflict of commitment, we have no problem necessarily about a faculty member setting up a small business on the outside. In fact, there are lots of reasons where you think that's absolutely a great idea. And if this is the only way or the best way to commercialize an idea for societal good, for societal benefit, we want to encourage it. And in a crazy way that you might not have thought of, these small businesses, well, you've heard lots of discussion about this in the last several months, but small businesses are the backbone of the economy in this country. They're the lifeblood of many towns like this. We want to encourage these small businesses, and where we can, aid small business development in our area, in Charlottesville, Albemarle, Central Virginia. That's a good thing for us. That's responsible economic development. It creates jobs. Those jobs are important to us. So even if nothing else happens, creating jobs locally and helping develop the technology is a good thing. So we have no inherent problem with are faculty spinning off these companies on the side? And if they become rich and famous, I'm okay with that. I often joke and say, I hope they'll donate to the university when they become rich, but in many cases they do. But that's not the end point that's really important. The important is societal good. And in some sense, that's increased by things like economic development in the region. But it's not uncommon for them to want to contract from their small business back to the university. And we expressly permit this, and I'm going to talk about this more in a little bit. But that's a conflict of interest. And it may be a conflict of interest under HHS guidelines. It may be a conflict of interest in the state code, which I haven't talked about but will in a minute. But we have a number of ways, I think they're exquisitely carefully crafted, to make it possible for us to work with faculty businesses in this context. So it's not only is it not prohibited, in many ways I think we encourage it because we know that the benefit to the institution and society is huge. And in fact, actually, if you've not looked around, boy, there are some successful local businesses with a lot of employees that are there because faculty had great ideas and they started companies around them. So I'll come back to some more, Neil. Raise your hand if I don't cover it in great detail.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Dave. Sorry if I'm preempting
No.
later slides here.
No, it's perfectly okay. So where we do have conflict management plans, some of this is dictated by the way that the NIH, for example, our major sponsor, requires us to report. But usually these conflict management plans address things like budget oversight. I talk about fiscal integrity. If we've got we're concerned that faculty don't misuse their positions to take advantage financially of the situation. But that's OSP is always looking after budgets. We pay attention to budgetary integrity. We're concerned about data integrity. Again, that's part of our objectivity. So many management plans will have built in some form for review of data. We want transparency. If we've got the conflict management plan usually says everyone on the research team has to be notified about the nature of the financial relationships. And those significant financial interests and conflicts have to be disclosed in public presentations. So if you're going to write a manuscript, if you're going to give a public paper, if you're going to show a poster at a conference, you need to disclose the financial relationships behind this. And we're concerned in some of these situations that trainees or students not be taken advantage of or be seen to be taken advantage of. Going back to the situation that Neil sort of proposed, if we had a faculty member company supporting research in their lab, and we often have that, and we can support that, we can make that work. You can imagine a situation where the faculty member's company is paying for a graduate student in his or her own lab. And what we worry about is the graduate student will somehow feel like they've been taken advantage of, that they've not been treated fairly. In fact, a micro example would be the graduate student who says, you know, I could have finished my project in 4 years instead of 6, but my faculty member kept insisting I worked on these projects related to their company, not related to my dissertation. So to make sure that doesn't happen, we provide what I would call backstops. We make it very clear to the students who they can turn to for help if they have any concerns. And we, in some cases, we reach out to those students. In rare cases, I've actually been asked to go speak to the students at lab meetings to describe to them the nature of the conflicts and discuss with them the resources they have for seeking help if they have a problem. And so far, we've not received any complaints like that, but I think that means our program is working effectively. But that's the whole point. We don't want students to feel like they've got any concerns about the way the project is being executed because there's a financial conflict of interest. But to get back to something that I was hinting at from Neil's question, in addition to the conflicts of interest that we might have because of federal regulations or other sponsor requirements, we're state employees. And as state employees, we're bound by the conflict of interest regulations in the Virginia Code. And I can give you the code reference sections. You can look these up. As a Commonwealth of Virginia citizen, I think we've got a good conflict of interest statute. I think it's well written. I think it's carefully considered, and I think it does a pretty good job. It's come in for some pretty serious inspection in recent years. So as you may recall, one of our governors, a couple of governors ago, got in real trouble for failing to disclose properly and running afoul of the Virginia Conflict of Interest Code on conflict of interest. So there were some changes made, but I think the standards are reasonable from the point of view of a voter. So I don't find them overbearing or unsettling. And to the extent that they affect us, I think they recognize our position and we can work with them very effectively. I think the statutes are well written. I think they work. But the crux of what is in the financial interest code for our discussion is the code says, as an employee, I'm prohibited from having a significant financial interest in 2 contracts with my institution. And my employment contract counts as 1. So if you follow along the text I've written, so if I have a company on the side, any contract between my company and the university is that second contract, my employment contract being the first. And now I have a financial interest in 2 contracts, and that's prohibited under the code. Doesn't mean there are exceptions, but that's the basis of the prohibition. I can't have a financial interest in 2 contracts. That second contract causes the conflict. Well, under the state code, just to tell you what the trigger conditions are, the SFIs are defined as more than 5% a year in income or expected income. I'll come back in a second, or 3% equity. So the state says if I have $600 in income from the YMCA, that's not a significant financial interest under the statute. If I own 2% equity in a local startup, that's not a significant financial interest. It takes 3% equity. Now they use this phrase expected income in the state statutes for kind of a fun reason. So the statute is designed for, and I think I have this well, in fact, let me bring up the next line, but my spouse's interests count as my financial interest. So my spouse counts just like she was me, or he was me. And that means that if my spouse works for the institution, because I have an interest in her income, just like mine, that's the second contract. I'll come back to the second. But the expected income part is also designed to address this interesting question that a conflict might arise if a company, which the university might be talking to, promises my wife future income. So if I'm negotiating for a contract with the university on behalf of the university, or we sign a contract with a company and that company has promised my wife future income, and you can imagine what they're saying to me is, Dave, if you'll make sure we get this contract, we'll hire your wife to work for the company, with a wink and nod. That future income, that expectation of future income, doesn't have to be present income, triggers the statute. This idea that my spouse's financial interests are mine triggers what we think of traditionally as the nepotism statute. So nepotism is this, you can't hire your relatives. The Virginia Code does not have a specific nepotism standard. The nepotism falls out of the way the conflict of interest statute is written. So the conflict of interest statute says, my wife's income is my financial interest. That contract is the second contract. If she works for my institution, I've got a conflict of interest. Now, there are exceptions, of course. And in fact, for nepotism, if we work for different state agencies, that doesn't count. If we work for the same agency but different divisions, it doesn't count. There is actually room for, we could actually be in the same department And there's some really fun code for this. I haven't looked at it in a long time, but I think it says if we worked in the same department for more than 5 years before we got married, it doesn't count. Okay, so if we've been there a long time together in the same department, it's okay if we get married. If we're in the same department, but we have separate reporting lines, this can be approvable. So there are exceptions for this. And some of you may actually have departments. It's not uncommon because the way faculty meet their prospective spouses in laboratories working the same discipline, there are people working the same department on the same topic that would trigger this. But there is a provision for our Board of Visitors to approve these. And relative to research, as I've indicated, the Virginia Code has several provisions. I call them exceptions and exemptions. I think the statute uses both phrases that are specifically written. Let me restate that. The Virginia Code is specifically written with exceptions and exemptions that refer to state institutions of higher education. So there are, I don't want to call them loopholes because they're not loopholes. They're specifically directed exceptions and exemptions that the state have given us that other state agencies can't use. So they recognize that we have a special position because the nature of the work we do that means that we have to be able to work with conflicts of interest that would not be permitted elsewhere. So the Department of Prisons, the Department of Mines, the Department of Mental Health, they can't do some of the stuff we can do because these exceptions and exemptions are specifically designed for the higher education institutions. This means that with proper review and approval, and maybe with a management plan, the university can enter into contracts with faculty-owned companies or companies from which our faculty members derive income. These might be the situation where a small business has gotten an SBIR, Small Business Innovative Research, STTR, Small Business Technology Transfer Research. And that's a common situation. A faculty member sets up a small business. The small business seeks their own funding, but because they lack the resources to do the research, the small business contracts with UVA to do the research. And that's going to cause a conflict of interest, but we do that, and we do it all the time. And the state code is specifically written to permit that. It's less common that we have conflicts where the money is flowing out of the university. You can appreciate that this has a different feel to it. But if I'm contracting with my own company, so I'm sending money out of the university to the contract, if you let me kind of be cross about this, there better be a damn good reason why we're sending money to my own company. And in fact, the statute permits that. But this is a little bit like if I were the county administrator, me hiring my own business to pave the roads. That's not going to look good. There better be a doggone good reason. In fact, you can't do that if you're the county administrator. But we can, under some situations, have money flowing out to a faculty-owned company. There are more hoops to jump through because this may get into purchasing requirements. There may be sole source requirements and so on. But we can do that. And we do it under special circumstances. So the key point here is that the state code says you can't do these things. The state code is written in a way that we can with proper approval. In the present climate, until we make some additional changes, most of these approvals require the president to sign off. And the president's office has been super careful all these years. And we take a substantial number of these conflict of interest exceptions to the president. The president's office has never withheld his or her signature. So they work with us very carefully because they know we have a very rigorous review process, legal's involved. We're very thorough in the way we have the management plan. And I think the president's office respects our input on this. So we enter into contracts. Excuse me. So we enter into contracts which are parts of conflicts of interest, which no other state institutions except the higher education institutions can. There are also issues with conflicts of interest when we're dealing with human subjects. Beyond the issue of who's sponsoring the trial, the welfare of our human subjects is always a concern. So anytime we have researchers with a conflict of interest involved in a human subjects trial, we're concerned. And our basic approach is essentially the same as at any other institution in the country. We have what we call the rebuttable presumption. This is kind of a weird legal term, but the way I translate this is our default position, going back to our thou shalt not approach, is if you've got a conflict of interest, you may not participate in the human subjects trial, period, end of sentence. The default is you may not participate in human subject trials. However, we have what we call the rebuttable presumption. The presumption is you may not, but we'll let you rebut that presumption and argue the contrary. So we will listen to an investigator who says, I know the rule says I can't be involved in these human subjects trials, but here's why I think it's important. And the Conflict of Interest Committee will evaluate that argument. In some cases, will permit a conflicted individual to participate in trials. We're going to take a careful look at it. Pardon me. It's going to take a lot of thinking, but it's doable. If the investigator says, I didn't design the experiments, it's a multi-center trial and somebody else did the design, I won't be involved in the recruiting or consenting of the subjects, I will have no subject contact, I won't be collecting any of the subject data, and an outside biostatistician will do all of the analysis of the data, and any papers will be authored by a group, so I can't overrule others about the data analysis. We will, in some sense, said we're worried about design, conduct, or reporting of the research. If we've built a firewall, if we take them out of the loop, and they can't increase the risk to human subjects by recruiting them, we might let them participate. But we do this with great care. I'm going to switch to talking about research misconduct. We're right at 11 o'clock. I can stop and take a couple questions. And if you wish, if you need to refill your coffee cup or take a bio break, we can take 2 minutes or 3 minutes here and get back together. If you wish, in fact, why don't I just say by default, let's take 2 minutes and we'll come back in 2 minutes and I'll start back up again if that's okay. But I'll take questions. Shoot me a note on chat if you want to come back with a question, and we'll start with those in 2 minutes. So I'm back early, ready to take any questions. And while I'm sitting here for a minute, I'm going to try to turn off the ringer on my phone.